Chicago Energy. I am the City Chicago Energy Policy Coordinator with the Illinois Environmental Council and your host for this evening. Here at IEC, we represent over 100 environmental organizations across the state to help unite our voices to engage in advocacy for sustainable environment. And our work has started to have IEC engage in Chicago policies and ordinances. And in this effort, we actually put together our first ever City Council scorecard, which I'm gonna drop in the chat. And our other people tonight have actually both received 100%, and they are part of our Green Champion cohort because of their vocal advocacy on environmental issues and making sure that they're talking about the issues that our environmental communities are concerned about. So I'm going to turn it over to the others to give us a quick introduction, and we will go by word. So Alderperson Spata, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, as we often do with our roll call votes as well, the first word frequently goes first. Good evening. My name is Daniel Spata. I use he, him pronouns. I am 2 years and 2 months into representing the first ward, which comprises communities in Logan Square, Humboldt Park, Wicker Park, Westtown, and the East Village. I am glad to be here as someone who is concerned by our present, as someone who 10, 15 years ago, I remember being at events at Columbia University with Jeffrey Sachs saying that if we don't act in the next 3 years, we will be past due. And we are 15, almost 20 years back past when I first heard that. I feel like I'm fighting for myself. I'm fighting for my constituents. I'm fighting for who I'm going to be in 2050, perhaps 2070. What kind of a Chicago do I want to be experiencing as a senior? What kind of Chicago planet do I want to leave to my kids? So I feel deeply vested in this work, and I'm glad to be partnering with such innovative and powerful and forceful organizations like IEC.
Thank you so much, Alderperson Spata. I appreciate you being here with us tonight, and for that wonderful, introduction. So now we will turn it over to Alderperson Martin.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Danny. It's always a pleasure to follow in Daniel's footsteps, as I do in more ways than one. I'm Matt Martin. I use he, him pronouns. I am the alderman in the 47th Ward. Like Daniel, just a little bit over 2 years into it. The 47th Ward covers primarily Lincoln Square, Ravenswood, and North Center. We have some parts as well of Roscoe Village, Uptown, West Lakeview, and Andersonville. It's a real privilege to be working with you all, in no small part because I think when people think about city council and city government, environmental protection and sustainability is probably not often at the top of their minds. And we're working to change that. But the ways in which we're doing so is with groups like IEC, with our residents, with folks who are environmental champions in ways both big and small. Really looking forward to today's conversation, in part because we know about the important work that other countries can do, our own country can do through entities, including but not limited to the EPA. I don't think that people give sufficient attention to what cities and neighborhoods can and should be doing, especially when it comes to resiliency, knowing that with our communities warming, significant rainstorms becoming more frequent and more severe. As last week's New York Times article indicated, there's a lot to do around resiliency as well as protection. When we think about the best ways to use ARPA funds from the federal government, as well as capital funds beyond that going forward, hopefully infrastructure funds from the federal government, I think green infrastructure has to be at the top of that list. It's a way in which we can use funds responsibly in a one-time way that will pay dividends down the road. But we need to make sure that we have a list of items that we can tick down in just as conversant a way as we can about repaving and garbage collection, tree trimming, rodent abatement, the things that people most commonly associate with our offices. So I look forward to continuing this conversation, not just this evening, but going forward, because the only way in which we tackle this multifaceted issue, an intersectional issue, effectively is by working with IAC, the folks in this meeting and well beyond. So thank you so much for inviting me to participate.
Well, no, thank you. And folks, there you have it. A couple of IC screen champions, other people to talk about climate solutions. I do want to highlight a comment that Colleen dropped in the chat. If you guys feel free to introduce yourselves, you can ask questions throughout the event. I'll make sure to note them so we can ask them during the question and answer portion at the end of our event. But feel free to introduce yourselves. Tonight, we are being joined by a few expert panelists from IAC affiliates to help give us insight on the issues of decarbonization, transportation electrification, funding for these projects, and community engagement. Tonight with us, we have Brian Ubraszewski, who is the Director of Environmental Health Programs at the Respiratory Health Association. So RHA is committed to passing policies that address clean air and lungs health concerns. And in that fight, they have been actively working alongside IAC and their affiliates in making sure that the CTA has long-term plans to achieve an all-electric bus fleet and more. Brian brings a wealth of knowledge in the work of public transportation. We also have Dave Collada, who is the Executive Director of Citizens Utility Board. CUB has been representing the interest of residential utility customers since its inception in 1984. Their focus is to work for lower rates and better service from state investor-owned electric, gas, and telephone companies. And in that work, they have helped save over $20 billion for customers by blocking rate hikes and fighting for consumer refunds. As we begin to move forward towards a sustainable future for our city, they have been strong advocates for decarbonization of buildings, which Dave will touch on a little bit later tonight. Joining us as well is Quinn Beaver, who is a policy analyst at Elevate. Elevate has been working for the past 2 decades to champion programs, policies, and build partnerships to foster a more just and equitable world where everyone has clean and affordable heat, power, and water in their homes. Quinn will help us give some insight on funding challenges with some solutions that will be discussed later tonight. And rounding out our panel tonight is Taseen Murji, a conservation organizer with the Sierra Club Illinois chapter. Sierra Club has been committed to protecting the diversity of our state's natural resources by advocating on campaigns for conservation, clean water, clean energy, and transportation. And Taseen will give us some insight on some of the federal work that is coming into play that will help give us some of the funds that we need towards these issues, and also give us some advice on how to move our electeds towards that. So tonight we will let our expert panelists give us a little bit of insight on their topics, and then we will have the others give us some of the insight on the proposals and ordinances or solutions that they have been working with their colleagues towards these issues. So with that being said, that's enough of me talking. We're gonna get started. I'm gonna turn it over to Brian Ubraszewski to get us started on transportation.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Danny. And part of the problem here is that there's too much information to go through. So I'll try and get through most of what I had hoped to say, but there's going to be a lot of questions still at the end that we can go into later if people have questions. My organization was founded in 1906. We work on lung health, and because of that, I see everything we do and work on in terms of environmental issues, in terms of how does it affect lung health, how does it affect people's lives, how does it keep people alive. And in that view, sadly, Chicago still has a problem with air pollution. We don't meet federal health standards for ozone, which is usually called summertime smog. And while Cook County meets federal air quality standards adopted by the Trump administration for fine particulate matter, we still have the 8th dirtiest county, and we live in the 8th dirtiest county in the United States in terms of fine particulate matter levels. And the scientific reality is that for fine particulate matter, no matter what the standard is, that gets into your lungs, it gets into your bloodstream, it triggers ER visits, hospitalizations, and premature deaths. And the science shows that there's really no safe level other than 0. Any amount of this fine particle soot triggers health problems. And the only time you get zero health impacts is when people are breathing zero fine particulate matter. So anything we can do to minimize that harmful exposure, including what comes out of vehicle tailpipes, is going to bring Chicagoans health benefits and save lives. There's a few official air quality monitors around Chicago, but they're really background air quality monitors. They don't really pick up the higher pollution risk near major roadways and facilities that attract large numbers of polluting vehicles, like a intermodal freight station or a big warehousing operation. It's important to know. I want to point out that air pollution doesn't affect everybody equally either. It's not just a question of how much you breathe, but how vulnerable you
Looks like maybe we lost Brian for a minute.
Yes, I was wondering if that was just me.
Let's give him
We'll give him a second.
it looks like he dropped if we want to move on to the next
Yeah.
panelist and bring Brian back.
Yeah. We can move on to the next piece. We'll come back to transportation in 1 second when Brian comes back. So our next piece is actually going to be talking about decarbonization, and I'm going to turn it over to Dave Collada from CUB to give some insight, and we'll come back to transportation in a little bit.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I want to thank my fellow panelists and the Illinois Environmental Council for putting this together. I'm privileged to serve on the board of the IAC, and they do a tremendous amount of good work, and we're really proud of that. And of course, thank you to Alderpersons Spata and Martin for their strong leadership on this issue. I think many people have heard about the Clean Energy Jobs Act, and we're certainly in the Clean Jobs Coalition still working to pass that, and are hopeful that something can get across the finish line there to continue the great progress we've made in the state over the last 20 years in pursuing affordable clean energy strategy. And we're hopeful that will get across the finish line. But today I want to talk about building a decarbonization, which is something that is very important. And it's a very difficult topic, but one that I think that we have some opportunities on, and we're going to be forced to deal with it, as I'll explain, whether we like it or not. So what do I mean by building decarbonization, and why is it important? Well, what the city climate action plan, they've studied this, and right now 70% of Chicago emissions of total climate change emissions, climate pollution, are associated with fossil fuel usage in buildings. So we're basically talking here about heat, that we use natural gas to heat. And that is obviously a fossil fuel that makes it difficult to reach our climate change objectives. So there's a real strong need to decarbonize buildings. And right now, based on all the evidence and the studies that have been done, what that means is basically electrifying buildings, moving to high efficiency heat pumps, maybe geothermal systems, because this is by far and away, it appears the most cost effective, the cheapest way to decarbonize buildings. There are some other potential solutions around, for example, green hydrogen, but without getting into all the details, a lot of things would have to happen for the economics of that to ever make sense. So at the end of the day, we know what needs to happen here to decarbonize buildings. You electrify them, and then of course in tandem with getting to 100% clean and renewable energy. And that's what we need to do here to meet our climate change goals. So it's essential to do building electrification to meet those justifiably ambitious climate goals that the city has set. It's also not just climate change, though, because the people's gas system that we have now for heat in the city is basically functionally insolvent. And what I mean by that is people's gas over the last decade or so has been undergoing a pipeline replacement program that has really created a massive affordability crisis in the city of Chicago. So as of September of last year, 30% of people's gas customers, 30% were basically structurally in arrears and could not pay their bills. And that's a situation that's going to get worse over time because this program is very much out of control, their pipeline replacement program. And so this tees up a question of, well, wait a minute, not only do we need to decarbonize buildings to meet our climate change goals, but honestly, we need to find other options for consumers, for city residents who can't pay their bills as it is. And it's something that is a very complicated issue. It's a very tricky issue, but it's one that we have to confront. We have to confront it honestly and with equity and affordability in mind, because you can absolutely, given that the program is functionally insolvent as it is, and we're just simply at this point kind of papering that over, a real risk here is that with heat pump technology improving and getting lower costs every year, you could absolutely find a scenario where people are like, why am I paying $50, $60, $70 in fixed charges on my gas bill when I can get better heat that's more comfortable, that doesn't have pollutants associated with it, that evidence increasingly shows that cooking gas is definitely worse for your health than I would have thought, but there's quite a bit of scientific evidence now that it poses real issues. And people will do that. The people who will do that first, of course, are those who can afford it, who have money. But then every person who leaves the system, you're then trying to recover those costs over those who are left. And so there's a real equity challenge here as well. Now, all these problems, I think, are solvable. I think there are really good opportunities here, but it's something that the city is going to have to work with a strategy here to move forward on. One of the things that we were very encouraged about was when Mayor Lightfoot's administration, they put out a RFI associated with the ComEd franchise agreement. Now, I think a lot of the headlines, understandably so, focused on, well, is there some alternative to ComEd as a poles and wires company? And we'll see. But one of the things that we really liked about the RFI was that it said what is true, which is that the city can create multiple franchises. And while it doesn't really make sense to have like two poles and wires companies in the same city, at the end of the day, that probably is a natural monopolistic function for the foreseeable future. But that doesn't mean that there's not other opportunities here. And one of the things that we've been scoping out is to what extent could the city create a geothermal utility to put in the backbone of essentially a decarbonized heating system. And one of the advantages of that we see is that you could spread the costs over a longer period of time, which I think could reduce some of the short-term affordability issues. But also at the end of the day, if there's a concern about heat pumps, and it's a legitimate concern, even though the technology is improving, it's that what happens in a really, really cold snap, right? If we have a polar vortex, does it work at -10? Does it work at -15? The answer is yes, but there are admittedly some issues around that. So an advantage of geothermal, of course, is it takes that concern away, because essentially the Earth is a stable temperature. If you just go like 6 feet down, it's about 55 degrees or so. Don't quote me on that, but it's basically right year round. And so you can greatly improve the efficiency of the system, taking away these issues that people may have about really cold weather. And also, at the end of the day, those geothermal systems also have benefits on the electric side of things too, because it helps reduce peak demand because your air conditioners don't need to work as hard. So it's really a twofer. We aren't saying that this is a magic bullet, It's something that that needs to be studied, and there needs to be an implementation plan and perhaps pilots to move forward on this idea. But it's the type of thing, creative thinking, that I think is important and that this RFI really tees up, because one thing we know is that the status quo isn't working. It's not working for climate, and it's definitely not working for consumers who are paying their gas bill and having increasingly difficult times doing it. And so at CUB, we are committed to trying to find the best, most affordable solutions to meeting our climate change goals. We can do this, but it's something that will require some hard work to move forward on. But it's something that if we don't succeed in it, not only we will not succeed in our meeting our climate change goals, but we will also just have people continuing to fall further and further behind on paying their bills with the affordability crisis that only ramps up over time. So a very, very important issue. It's one that we look forward to working on, and definitely appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today, and happy to answer any questions if they come up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave, for that insight. I know there was a lot to unpack there, and I want to turn it over to the other persons to give us some insight on, some of the stuff that Dave mentioned and some of the work that they're doing in regards to decarbonization. So I'll turn it over to Alderman Spata first, and then I'll let Alderman Martin follow.
Unmute myself. I am unmuted. Yeah, thank you so much, Dave, for the introduction. I probably would not have believed this when I first came into the office, but we are currently in the middle stages of a decarbonization working group that was put together through Angela Tovar, the city's chief sustainability officers. And this could have easily been something just as a performative exercise, but I've been really encouraged by how robust those conversations have been. There's 3 tracks within their working group right now in terms of financing and incentives, existing buildings, and new construction. I've actually been in the existing building space, which, Danny, I think that's the track you're on as well, but it's been really exciting because that is, of course, going to be the vast majority of what decarbonization looks like. It's going to be a beautiful thing for Chicago to get to a net zero building code, and I think we can get there and we need to get there. But the vast majority of us will still live in buildings that, like the building I live in, is about 115 years old. That's going to be the work, and that's going to look like a few different things. It's this balance between mandates and voluntary, incentives and requirements. So what does that mean? It's probably going to look like something like what New York City has in terms of, and St. Louis, a Building Energy Performance Standards Ordinance, or BEPS, where in New York, for instance, every building over 25,000 square feet is going to be required to make energy efficiency improvements over the years. If that was all it was going to be, though, that wasn't going to be really equitable for Chicago. There's a version of decarbonization that predominantly benefits commercial tenants and wealthy white communities. And if that was Chicago, then those most impacted by climate change, by environmental injustices, would be the least likely to reap the benefits, to have a path towards decarbonization. So that's the other critical piece of this work for us, is how do we create the right incentives, the right achievable and practical forms of retrofitting that every community, that every household can benefit from. In particular, smaller, older properties, like the ones that I live in, like the ones that a lot of folks in Market Park, Pilsen, Hermosa live in. That's an important work for us. We're going to have a lot of work to do in terms of building up the financial and technical support that's needed for this to happen. I know we're going to be talking about the Green Bank, but figuring out how do we build the governmental infrastructure to make this work? How do we incentivize the kind of workforce that it's going to take to decarbonize the whole of this city? how do we create the trust in both government institutions, but also our utility that gets us on the path where Chicagoans understand this? And I would end by saying the political will to make this happen. It's why I'm thankful for this space. I'm thankful for partners like Alderperson Martin, Alderperson Haddon, and many others. But we have a city that struggles to view climate change and decarbonization as a priority. Just today, we had the mayor saying that until we solve gun violence, nothing else matters. And gun violence is an urgent priority. Let's be true for that. But we have to be a city that can balance multiple issues at once. We are currently a city that has always said something else is going to come before climate change. Something else is going to become before sustainability. We've been doing that for the past 10 years. We can't afford to do that anymore. And so we're going to keep working on the inside on decarbonization and the matters we're talking about. But we are going to look to all of you to help pressure the 48 or so other folks who aren't in the room for the robust decarbonization programs and policies that Chicago's going to need.
Thank you so much, Alderperson Spata. I'll turn it over to Alderperson Martin for some of his insight.
Thank you. One thing that I really want to pull out and dwell on a little bit that Daniel said, and he said a lot of terrific things, is what we can be doing outside of our city-owned and operated buildings, because we have a goal by, I think, approximately 2035 to be relying 100% on renewable energy to power those buildings. So perhaps not carbon neutral necessarily, but something that is fairly ambitious, fairly in line with what the Paris Climate Accords put out, but that's not, of course, our entire building stock. So I think it's one thing for us to say with those city-owned and operated buildings, we're going to push forward with certain very ambitious goals, but what are we going to do from a residential and small commercial standpoint, which comprises so much of the city's physical footprint? That's where I think what we're doing right now, in terms of those city-owned and operated buildings, my understanding is that we put an RFP out, we're reviewing contracts, working on finalizing a contract with at least one energy supplier. Is what lessons learned are there from that could apply to municipal aggregation or community choice aggregation. Different places talk about it in different ways, but essentially taking that principle and expanding it in my preference would be an opt-out way for the residential and small commercial context, with the idea being that we have a collective action problem. We have lots of situations in which folks have goals, they have priorities, they have aspirations, but they have so many other things that they're doing day in and day out, and they need folks like Daniel and myself working in concert with terrific activists in our communities and organizations like IEC to put forth ideas that they can weigh in on, and hopefully if we do our jobs well, that they'll support. And municipal aggregation, in my opinion, is just such an idea, because that's a way for us to really continue supporting and propping up terrific organizations that are doing great work around solar and wind, to say we are going to bring our city's collective pocketbooks to bear. We want to make sure that the ways in which we all are spending our hard-earned money reflects our collective values, and that it's one thing for city-owned and operated buildings to do things kind of like green roofs. I think probably a lot of folks remember when, I think it was the second Mayor Daley was touting the green roof above City Hall. Well, okay, stand on there, and for so long you look out and you just see a bunch of blacktops and other non-colorful rooftops for those adjacent buildings. We need to be able to look all the way from Rogers Park down south to really Northeast Indiana and say, what are we going to be doing as a city when it comes to all of our building stock, not just the several dozen or several hundred that the city has control over. So that's something where I'm really excited. We've had a number of conversations with activists, with Chief Tovar, as well as with David Reynolds in Assets, Information, and Services, the new 2FM, if you will, to see not only whether this is feasible, and I think all indications are it is feasible, but how quickly we can bring that on board. And just one other way in which I'll underscore another one of Daniel's terrific points about this needs to be a priority. If we're going to declare as city council we've done that we're in the midst of a climate emergency, we need to be able to take actions and then point to those simultaneously as being reflective of the emergency that we're now facing. And so as I think about the waste study that just came out and the ways in which they say from a recycling standpoint, from a composting standpoint, here are things that we need to do. We need to take those pieces of advice, those recommendations, and push forward as aggressively as possible. As city council members, we cannot afford to continue looking to the administration to prioritize these issues appropriately. We're an elected body. We have a lot of agency here. And if the mayor's office will be charting the priorities, some of which Daniel already talked about, we need to be able to step in and say, here's what we're going to do. It's going to be terrific for an environment. It's going to be good for our economy as well. And it's ways in which doing so in an effective way provides ways in which we can engage residents in new and profound ways. So please continue to push us in that regard, to let us know consistently that these are priorities that we should have. Push our partners as well, as Daniel mentioned, on city council, because at the end of the day, this needs to be right up there alongside public safety, along with the city's financial health, along with affordable housing as one of the key priorities that everyone should be conversant and fluent with as elected officials when folks are asking them what their priorities are.
Yes, thank you both for highlighting the importance of the intersections of this this issue and how important it is for us to make sure that we're fighting for it together. So very, very important stuff. So I know that Brian had a little bit of issues earlier in his feed. So Brian, if you're there, we will let you take it back over with transportation.
Sure. Thanks, Danny. And the next IEC event is going to be on telecom and reliability. So I think I talked about the inequity of exposure to air pollution and how that puts certain communities at risks. And then, how we usually think of as coal as like the big source of pollution, but in reality is that transportation is now the largest source of air pollution that affects people's health. It's also the biggest source of greenhouse gases in Illinois. So we have a huge challenge in front of us. There's a big push to get as many zero emission electric vehicles on the road as quickly as possible. And that's not exactly easy because you have to build them. And you also have to have the infrastructure in place to be able to recharge those batteries without causing utter havoc. So we're sort of at step one right now. EVs are still a fraction of the overall fleet. There's about 30,000 or so EVs on the road in Illinois. That's way less than 1%. But it is double what was there in 2019. And what was there in 2019 was double the number of EVs that were there in 2017. So we're seeing a doubling every 2 years. And if you continue that forward, you get something like 600,000 vehicles in Illinois by 2030. And that's without any new incentives, without more vehicles coming off of factory showrooms, without federal incentives or state policies that are going to change to accelerate that. So it's worth keeping in mind how fast this is actually growing. Now, the long-term benefits of more EVs, as more of them are made and sold, the vehicle prices are going to come down. They're going to become more available to folks with moderate incomes. There's going to be a used market for those vehicles that grows too. And that's going to spread the benefits of EVs among a wide slice of the population. EVs cost a fraction to charge compared to the cost of fueling a conventional vehicle. People are going to save money. They have fewer moving parts to break, and they require less maintenance. And that's even Consumer Reports is doing studies on this now. And even with a higher upfront cost now, the cost of ownership, how much it costs per month, is actually about that of a conventional vehicle right now. And like I said, they're getting cheaper to own and operate every single year. So if you have a place to charge your car, they're going to save you money. And that's where infrastructure is very important. EV infrastructure is going to look very different than gasoline gas station infrastructure that we have out there now. For people who have a parking space with a place to plug in, about 10% of their charging for their vehicle is going to be done at home. mostly overnight. So it's like having a gas station for 80% of the miles you run your car in your own garage. But not everybody has a personal space to plug in. And so we need publicly available chargers at convenient locations, both fast chargers that will charge your car in a few minutes, and slow chargers that charge cars over the course of several hours. Secondly, standard car charging voltage is 240 volts. The devices you buy to charge an electric car about 240 volts. And very few parking spaces anywhere, home or not, have those 240 volt circuits near an automobile, much less have the EV charging box that attaches to those wires. So this means a lot of electrical work needs to be done, and it's going to be an extensive project over a long period of time. And those fast chargers that I was talking about that can charge your car in a few minutes, kind of like a gas station, the cost of those ranges anywhere from $50,000 to over $300,000. And it's a process that takes months, requires lots of permits, both probably from the city and from utilities, to get before it can actually be built. So building infrastructure is not going to be easy or cheap, but it's an investment that will save people money and preserve health as we drive into the future. That being said, what I'm not going to get into, but to say there are other issues to consider too. Not everybody has a car. So we have to look at electrifying things like the CTA and cabs and rideshare. And then we have commercial vehicles, which are almost all run on diesel and which are a huge source of air pollution, especially in some of those vulnerable communities, that we also have to look at how are we going to electrify those vehicles that serve the freight basis of a good chunk of Chicago's economy. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Alderman, and you can go on.
Yeah, no, thank you for giving us that insight. And I know there has been some work regarding the EV infrastructure piece. So I'm going to turn it over to Alderman Martin this time first to give us a little bit more insight on that, and then we'll let Alder Spata go after.
Yeah, I think all of Brian's points, and surprisingly, are completely spot on, and things that myself, Daniel, and others on council are very sensitive to right now. We, alongside Chairman Howard Brookins, recently introduced a resolution calling for a series of subject matter hearings on just this topic, knowing that as we see more and more car companies committing to produce an emission-free fleet within the next 10 to 15 years, it's incumbent upon cities, including Chicago, to see around the curve and to plan for that so that 7, 8, 9 years from now, we're not hurdles to folks having electric vehicle cars when that is a viable option for them, as it increasingly is. So being able to figure out not just what the technology is right now, but where it's headed is really important, because we have menu funds that I've already confirmed with the budget office that we can allocate towards charging stations. But yeah, we can. I see you there, Daniel. And then hopefully we'll be getting some federal funds as well through the infrastructure bill that can help augment that work. A critical question, though, and Brian touched upon a lot of this, is what's the best placement for this? My understanding is a majority of households in Chicago are in multi-unit buildings. Majority do not have a dedicated parking space for each one of those units. So where would it be most ideal for folks to charge, and where is the technology headed in ways that would allow that to happen? I know that there are some pilots in San Francisco right now where it's a battery swap in ways where it's about over 10 minutes. You hoist up a car, replace the battery with a fully charged one. So talking with industry experts to see, is that a path that we're headed on? Is that viable? Is it one of several paths? And what can we do if that is one of the paths to help accommodate that? Same thing with, say, street charging. Maybe on a light pole is where we would want to affix one or more chargers for folks who can only charge on the street. And then understanding, I know that this has come up a few times in the chat as well, that for folks who don't have personal cars for any number of reasons, what we're going to do with regard to EV there. And so again, Daniel and I have been championing work around holding hearings with CTA to talk about the electrification of their bus fleet, knowing that a big impediment to them doing that as quickly as is necessary is getting the requisite funding. And at the end of the day, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the federal government is going to be hugely helpful in order to get us the funds that's going to ensure that our policies align with our values. And even with that, there's a lot of infrastructure to talk about, because you can't have the station layout that you have right now with electric vehicle charging stations in place for buses. So do we need to think about having just a reconfiguration of existing stations, new stations, maybe some in the short term, some bus lines are going to be more amenable to EVs than others. But again, to make sure that we're pushing our colleagues as well as the departments who are going to be taking the lead on this. And I'm excited where we're headed. I'm excited with the conversations that we've had with colleagues, that someone like Chairman Brookins is willing to hold subject matter hearings in ways where historically it's only when there's something great that the administration wants to roll out is when a chairman's willing to do something like that. But really recognizing that we are legislators, that we can provide oversight, that we can help generate discussion that will ultimately lead to sound policy. So I think this is in particular an area that there's a lot of good work that can be done and likely will be done in the coming months and years.
Perfect. Thank you so much for enlightening us. Alderman Spata, love to hear more from what you're working on.
Thank you. I'll say before that, I will say Alderperson Martin is not the sort to pat himself on the back, so I will. He did not share that he was one of the two lead sponsors of the EV Ready Ordinance in City Council, and I believe he was the first alderperson of our freshman class to get an ordinance passed, and it was that one. So like a hats off and an applause to Alderman Martin there. I will share, because we were talking about commercial vehicles and diesel, and this is one place where the challenge is less about the charging infrastructure than the adoption. And let me talk about that. So we have our sustainable development policy in Chicago. If you're doing a planned development, you need to score so many points on this menu of sustainability options to be able to do that development. One of them being charging stations. And so if you were to look at the new facilities that a Hilco is building, a Prologis is building, they're doing the charging stations. They're doing the infrastructure. The challenge is on the adoption side. And that's another place where Alderperson Martin and I work together to highlight the Drive Clean Chicago program here in the city. Led by Samantha Bingham over at CDOT. They were doing incredible work up until 2017 with funding available to facilitate the adoption of clean vehicles, of electric commercial fleets. Through our CMAQ funding, through other funding sources that were available. Unfortunately, the previous presidential administration threw up some roadblocks to using those funds. But those are roadblocks that are hopefully soon to be coming down, because we have a proven program in this city for electric vehicle conversion out of commercial diesel. So we were able to advocate for that program, to push for our CMAQ funds to be available, but also state funds that were put forward for vehicle electrification, for hopefully a portion of our Volkswagen settlement dollars to go towards this program and other ways for vehicle electrification in the city. I'll add one other thing in terms of diesel, because again, diesel vehicles running through our environmental justice communities and our city as in general are a huge challenge. One other thing that we're working on in kind of the infancy stages with Chief Sustainability Officer Angela Tovar, as well as CDOT Commissioner Gia Biaggi, is a kind of emissions tax. We're trying to take some inspiration from New York and London and thinking about what could be a proper emissions cordon for the city of Chicago. That if you're bringing these vehicles through environmental justice communities, through folks living adjacent to our industrial quarters, that there would be a daily penalty, same as you're seeing as other cities, as kind of a stick to go with the carrot of Drive Clean Chicago. We're in the early stages of that, but I am hoping that that is a policy, a program that we can find a feasible version of for Chicago to go with the EV infrastructure work happening through the Sustainable Development Program, through the work happening with EV readiness, and hopefully what whoever our future electric provider for the city is, that they will also prove a partner in this work. There's so many tools that can hopefully work together for us on this.
I appreciate all the great insight we're getting tonight. And, there's a lot of great conversations being had about some solutions to be had, but I know that a lot of these solutions come with some funding challenges. So to give us a little bit more insight on how to pay for some of these funding challenges, I'm gonna turn it over to Quinn Beaver from Elevate to enlighten us a little bit more about what a potential green bank could look like for Chicago.
Thanks, Danny. And I've got some slides prepared. There we go. Colleen's on it. So again, my name is Quinn Beaver. I'm a policy analyst at Elevate. Danny wanted me to talk to you about green banks and some of the funding solutions and challenges that are associated with it. And my goal is that by the end of this, you'll understand kind of what they are, how they work, and we'll be able to make up your mind about whether or not that's something we want for our great city of Chicago. So next slide, please. So green banks are public entities. An important thing to know is they're initially capitalized with public funds, and then those public funds are leveraged to attract private capital. And so that kind of creates sort of a cycle where funds get continually reinvested. And the objective of a green bank, as the name implies, is to drive clean energy investment. Also reducing carbon emissions, lowering energy costs for consumers, providing access for low and moderate income households to the clean energy transition. And all of those things require jobs. So that as well. Next slide, please. So they all vary in structure, green banks do, but they've got some common characteristics. So I wanted to outline those for you because they're a little bit enigmatic as far as, they don't all look the same, but for the most part, they're all independent. They have a mandate for low carbon, climate resilient investments. They focus on market gaps, so bringing in funding and investors. They're accountable to creating jobs, mobilizing private capital, creating a return on that capital, and then greenhouse gas reductions as well. Again, using those public funds, leveraging those public funds to produce more private capital and encourage private capital, and then removing barriers. The last one's kind of the big one, removing barriers to help achieve local climate development objectives. Next slide there. So how does it work? The role of a green bank is as much as it is about capital, about money. It's also a big part of it is about centralizing services. So connecting folks, like say if you want to do a clean energy project, whether you're a business owner or a homeowner or anybody else, you take that project to a green bank and they can connect you with lenders, investors, technical experts who do the work, co-investors, so you can kind of multiply the spending power. They've got financial tools, and this is kind of a big one too, because as we all know, like sort of emerging technology, this is something I'll talk about a little bit later, but emerging technology is often expensive, especially as it's new and just comes out. So creating access and financial tools so that everyone can access those advantages is really important. And so is risk mitigation, because for anyone who's trying to get a loan, the risk that is associated with taking that loan out is kind of determines your eligibility there. Bundling projects and bundling clients, and then advocating for smart climate and energy investment is huge, because that's the whole purpose of the green bank there. And so serving as a hub for kind of all those experts and all those actors, as well as the capital is kind of, that's the vehicle that is the green bank. So next slide, please. Here's kind of a diagram of it. So you can see on the right there, you've got government as the public funds. They pitch in, and then eventually private capital in the form of local foundations or any other kinds of private capital feed into a green bank, which is often a nonprofit, and they produce clean energy projects. And so those three orange boxes on the right there are actually, whenever you create a green bank, a lot of times you can kind of tap into the network of green banks. And there's a number of other green banks around the country that can kind of work together. And so I'll talk about that here in a second, but just to diagram that for you for the visual folks like myself. So what do those clean energy projects look like? They can take any form. I mean, when you think clean energy, you've got, up there on the top right is distributed generations. That's regular solar on the rooftop. Bottom left there is community solar. Kind of the bottom center and the bottom right is, efficiency, whether it's heat pumps or just making a furnace or boiler more efficient. Insulation and anything that deals with building envelopes. We've already talked about the importance of EV charging. I mean, the switching to electric vehicles is obviously the direction we're headed, but we've got to support those with infrastructure. So, and that infrastructure costs money. So that's kind of a huge part of the green bank's direction there as well. And then one thing I really want to point out too is a number of green banks have projects for climate resilience. So repairs to roofs, and for Chicago, as Alderman Martin already pointed out, there's, I think last week, a New York Times article that talked about flooding mitigation. And a lot of times we think about climate change and people will talk about coastal flooding, but Chicago's, being Lake Michigan adjacent and straddling the Chicago River, we've got our own flooding problems. And those are actually part of climate resilience. And so Green Bank considers those relevant as well. Next slide, please. So yeah, here's some national examples and just some tidbits about each. The NYSEG is the one on the far right there. That's New York City's Energy Efficiency Corporation. They were actually the first local and nonprofit green bank. And they're actually expanded beyond the city. And then, so you've got, let's see, who else do I want to feature here? So Michigan Saves. Part of the reason that they get mentioned a lot is Michigan Saves does a lot to open access. So again, as we talked about, like a lot of this clean energy stuff is often, at least initially, accessible to affluent folks who've got the money to pay for this kind of stuff. And so creating vehicles, financial vehicles to make clean energy accessible is a really big deal, because that way, you can put equity, you can prioritize equity, and you can make it so that folks who are low and moderate income can access some of these clean energy projects. And so, unsecured residential loans, which are tied to credit, which don't have payback mandates. So they're not related to, you don't have to pay back based on a certain efficiency. And that's kind of where the roof repair and flooding comes in. They've also got a loan loss reserve program, which lowers the minimum credit score, and a number of other tools. And I'll actually give some examples of tools if you click to the next slide. This is just a map of different green banks around the country. Again, for the visual, you can go back real quick if you could. For the visual folks, this is like the green ones are where green banks already exist. There's, I think over a half dozen there. And then where green banks are being created, those tan states, that's kind of another half dozen. So folks are really starting to recognize some of the opportunities that green banks can provide, and it's kind of spreading. And obviously Illinois is still in the gray there, but that's why we're talking about this. So next slide, please. So here's some examples of some of the financial tools. Energy efficiency loans typically operate like a regular loan, but then like I already talked about a little bit, the expanding capacity to finance. So an interest rate buy down is one example where utilities front capital And the sort of trade-off there is they get to claim credit on the financing, but then it buys down the capital, for example, from 6% to 3%. So you're paying half as much interest as you would before. That loan loss reserve, which I already talked about, lowering a credit score, a minimum credit score, kind of opens the doors to some other folks that wouldn't otherwise be able to access. There's a lease model that's, where you pay sort of a fixed price. You don't own the equipment, and then you kind of split the savings. I believe that's how block power functions. Pay as you save is one that some folks are familiar with. That's actually a loan that's tied to the utility meter, which is kind of unique. It's not tied to the person, and it's not even tied to the property. It's tied to the utility meter. So it can't jeopardize, it's not a lien. It's associated with the meter. So if you move, it stays with the meter, and it operates as on-bill financing. Conversely, PACE, which is Property Assessed Clean Energy, operates as a lien or a traditional property loan, which does require payback based on the efficiency. And kind of the idea there is that you take out a loan, you get efficiency equipment, you have a lot of savings, and then you use the savings that you would have otherwise been paying to the utility company to pay for your loan. And then eventually you would own that equipment. So next slide, please. And so the solutions hopefully are evident based on kind of the definition of what a green bank is. That creates that cycle of reinvestment. It utilizes the capital that gets reinvested across multiple sectors. So transportation with EV infrastructure, buildings with retrofits, and anything energy efficient, plus renewable energy that's associated with buildings, manufacturing, plus those climate resilience pieces that we talked about there. Again, emerging technology is often expensive, especially right when it comes out. And as time goes on, things get more affordable, but at least out of the gate, it's expensive, it's inaccessible, perhaps in its own right, but then sometimes expensive and therefore inaccessible based on just the cost. And so providing incentives or in the form of rebates, tax credits, or discounts, and those can be provided from the state, city, or utilities, and sort of having a hub for all of those tools. And then, once those sort of deductions are taken off, or those incentives are accounted for, then financing the rest of the cost with a tool that matches, a tool that matches the job is, a really important piece as well in terms of paying for all this stuff, because the world's our oyster, but paying for things is sometimes tricky, and regular loans don't always do the job. As the last bullet there points out, some projects are really big and really expensive, and so that can sometimes make it hard to get a loan. So deep building retrofits, especially for large multifamily buildings like we have in Chicago, or really small if you just want an EV charging station at a single family home, sometimes having too small a loan with no payback, sometimes that can be tricky as well. And so next slide. So the barriers is kind of like, in order to get some of these solutions, in order to establish a green bank, main one is money. That initial public capital is hard to get started. It's a lot easier to keep going because, again, as projects come along, they tend to be a lot lower risk than people realize. So these projects get funded and they get paid back based on the efficiency, which is the beauty of energy efficiency. And then the money kind of keeps being cycled and reinvested. But getting that initial seed money is sometimes tricky, especially in places where, and here's the key with sort of below average financial status, which I feel like as a born and raised Illinoisan, I can say it's kind of been our status for a long time. We just had a couple credit upgrades, I think, and we're doing a little bit better, but that can sometimes be tricky, especially, I mean, this is kind of goes down with the political will and leadership piece, is there's a lot of other things that require money, and so we need not only leaders that say, hey, this is something that's important, and fortunately in Alderman Martin and Alderman Spata that we've got with us, we've got that, but we also need to have the argument of, hey, why is this more important than other things we could fund? Because obviously money is limited, especially in some places more than others. But when it comes to flood mitigation and transitioning clean energy, and especially in environmental justice communities where it's most important that they benefit from the clean energy transition, that can be really important. Something else I want to point out, and fortunately we've got Dave Collada on the call as well, consumer protections. So for anyone who's a Last Week Tonight fan with John Oliver, like myself, he just, I think last month had an episode about PACE and how contractors were, offering these liens. So it's a loan on the property, right? Basically people who were interested in lowering their energy bills because everyone wants to lower their energy bills, right? And wanted to do the right thing as far as the environment. We're kind of getting taken advantage of with these predatory loans that they then couldn't pay for. And when it's a lien against your property, it can jeopardize, you can lose your house if the loan is associated with the property. So making sure that we have the appropriate consumer protections is crucial. And as I put there, bad examples are bad advocates. So, if this isn't done right, if it's not done equitably, some folks might say it shouldn't be done at all, and I would be inclined to agree. And so then the last thing that I put there is, I think, the most important, which is people power. We have to, if this is something that we as a city want to do, then we have to say that this is what we want, and sort of back up our political leadership to demand that, not only politically but also economically, as sort of demand drives down prices, and it has to be something that if we all decide that we want it, anything is possible. So what would it look like in Chicago is kind of the last question, and there you go. There's my information for anyone that wants to follow up with me, and I really appreciate the time. Thank you, Danny, and thank you to everybody else that's on the panel here.
Yes, thank you, Quinn. That was highly informational, and we are definitely not lack of people or political power. So I'm going to turn it over to the elders to give us some insight on what Chicago Green Bank can look like. So, Alder Spata, I'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Danny. I won't replicate what Quinn already said. I think he laid out the what and why really admirably. This really is the catalyst, the linchpin that makes a lot of these other measures work. It is hard to help people who have never traditionally had access to capital and traditional lending products to make the kind of improvements we're hoping for without a green bank. For some of the larger commercial properties that are going to ask us, why am I supposed to make these improvements if I'm going to sell this building in 3 years? A green bank helps facilitate the kind of investment lending that's going to be needed even for some of those measures. It is necessary. We need to work on this. I will say I wish we had our comrade in arms, Senator Robert Peters here, who, along with Alderperson Martin and myself, we've really been doing some plotting and scheming around banking reform and public banking in particular. Right now, Chicago has billions of dollars in municipal depositories that do very little on behalf of the people of Chicago, and generally are sitting in the accounts of banks that do very little on behalf of our constituents as well, that arguably, well, not even arguably, based on the data, participate in some really racially inequitable lending practices. It's a good case to be made that a green bank, and particularly a public green bank, could do a lot of work, particularly towards the sustainability, the decarbonization work that we hope to see. It's also worth being realistic about the timeline that this is going to take. So Quinn talked about the example of the DC Green Bank, and that's a great example for us to learn to. That recommendation first came forward back in 2017. It was signed into law by the mayor of the District of Columbia back in July of 2018. They spent 2020 building up their operations, staffing up that bank to get ready for a lot of the now really powerful investments that they're making. We are right now at that inspiration recommendation phase. So it is going to take a lot of work and persistence to get to the point that a green bank is a functional component of Chicago's financial infrastructure. Now, till then, I believe we can and should use our American Rescue Plan funds to jumpstart our decarbonization funding. One of the many purposes we should put that funding to and that we're working on, but I believe that piece and then the green bank down the line can facilitate a lot of the investments that we need to see for a more sustainable Chicago. I should also say I unfortunately need to drop off of the conversation at this point for another appointment, but it really has been a privilege to join you all this evening.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Alderman Spata. I'm going to turn it over to Alder President Martin to give us a final wrap up on the Green Bank.
So I think Daniel put it incredibly well, and I would underscore the point around this. There's intersectionality when it comes to banking, because I think you really see it in the context of housing as well. When you have a consolidation of those small and middle-sized banks into your larger Chases, your Bank of Americas, they're not going to be interested because it doesn't make sense for their bottom line oftentimes to invest in small scale, to say, hey, here's someone who wants funding to put a solar panel on, to do other retrofits, to be able to, as Daniel was indicating, and that we've heard from others, aggregate those instances in ways that, maybe that's not going to bring about 8, 9, 10% return right off the top of the bat, but it's the right thing to do. Same thing with regard to affordable housing. Same thing with other aspects in terms of public utilities or things that should be public utilities. And so I think that it's really important for us to be able to look to folks who are working in other industries, other subject matter areas, to be able to say, hey, let's join forces, because it is my sincere hope that we'll be able to do something in the near term with regard to a public bank, working with Robert Peters and others in Springfield. It sure would make for an especially persuasive case if we can talk about, in addition to a green bank or green aspect to a larger public bank, other aspects, so that collectively we can bring enough pressure to be able to make this happen. Because whether it's doing stuff on the small scale, literally home by home, business by business, maybe it's going to be folks whose creditworthiness under standard lending approaches isn't going to be ideal for, again, these large banks' bottom lines. Or it might be folks who want to do something innovative, where traditional lenders just might not have the tools in place, the expertise to be able to say, yes, we absolutely love what you're doing here. We're willing to go out on a limb with you to help advance larger goals. That's precisely what a public bank, a green bank, can be designed to do effectively. So really looking forward to having these conversations with the decarbonization working group, which already has come up several times, as well as colleagues on council, so we can help work shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm with you all to build that sort of support, that pressure to make this a reality.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're still have a little bit left, and I appreciate everyone being able to stay on just a little bit more. But I want to underscore an important thing that other person Martin had brought up earlier, the fact that we do need the federal government to step up and help us get some of these pieces funded. So I want to turn it over to my friend and colleague Tassine over at Sierra Club to give us some insight on some of the issues happening at the federal level that can help bring this funding towards us. So Tassine.
Cool. Thanks, Danny. So I'm sure all of you know right now, an infrastructure bill is moving through Congress in 2 chunks. So the first is a potentially bipartisan package centered around more traditional infrastructure proposals. There have been lengthy negotiations between various Senate groups and the president, and numerous bipartisan packages floated, but so far the Republican Senate offers have been woefully narrow and very small in scale. The second chunk is the big reconciliation package. We need a big, bold infrastructure package that is broad in reach, ambitious in scale, and centered in delivering investments in climate, equity, and jobs to meet the challenges of our time. So such a package can likely only be achieved by advancing it through budget reconciliation, which is a process that would allow passage with only a 51 vote majority. This would require the support of all 50 Democrats and the tie-breaking vote of Vice President Harris. So ultimately, we need like a combination of these two chunks, a legislative package that reauthorizes the transportation and drinking water programs. Is a critical piece of the strategy to achieve our broad vision, both for policy and political reasons, but it must also be accompanied by a reconciliation package that delivers the kind of transformative investments in climate and justice that Biden partially envisioned in his American Jobs package, and that we have been advocating for in our work on the Thrive Agenda, which is a pandemic recovery proposal package that aims to mend the unemployment crisis the pandemic triggered in the form of 16 million unionized and sustainable jobs. So we are advocating for a lot of infrastructure priorities, but one of the priorities that we've been advocating the most for is to improve access to public transit and produce union-built electric cars, trucks, and buses. The transportation sector is a bleeding source of carbon pollution in the States, and transportation is also a prime contributor to air pollution that poses major risks to public health, especially in communities of color. The $174 billion investment in the electric vehicle economy included in the president's original American Jobs Plan proposal is a really strong start, and it shows that the White House is intent on electrifying cars, transit buses, school buses, the federal fleet, which includes the US Postal Fleet and ports. So the Sierra Club, as a national organization, is urging Congress to pass a final bill with significant investments for domestic manufacturing and high labor standards to make sure American workers are not left behind as we rapidly transit to electric vehicles. So given this lay of the land, what we are currently doing right now is prepping our members and volunteers to request meetings with House reps to make sure that they are advocating for a big package and asking the most in this infrastructure bill. So what we're looking for is $1 trillion invested in renewable energy, $600 billion in retrofitting public housing, hospitals, schools, and $500 billion in electrifying public transportation, and $132 billion in a civilian climate corps. So when reps are back during recess, that's when we're going to start having meetings with them. That's kind of like the lobby top-down pressure we're going to put on our electeds. And then we're also going to try to do some more like grassroots organizing. So filling up their inboxes, demanding for high numbers, their voicemail inboxes too, maybe doing some more escalated tactics moving forward, TBD.
Thank you so much for that insight, Tassine. And like she mentioned, it's very crucial to get our federal government to help us prioritize this, not just for Chicago, for across our country. So if you guys are interested to join Tassine in her work, suggest that you follow Sierra Club. And unfortunately, we're a little bit over time tonight. So I know there's a few questions in the chat that did not get answered. I will make sure to follow up and get those answers for you and send that over to in an email and make sure that we continue having these discussions. And in regards to some of the issues that we talked to tonight, our friend Dave Collada from Citizens United Utility Board did mention the franchise agreement. There's actually going to be an upcoming town hall this Monday to discuss the franchise agreement some more. So I'm going to drop that information in the chat for anyone who's available this Monday at 6 p.m. Make sure you come listen in, because this is very much tied into the decarbonization and electrical vehicle work infrastructure that we need to get past. So there was a lot of information tonight, a lot of great conversation, and like the other people have mentioned, it's going to take all of us working together to make sure that we push the other 48 members of City Council towards those goals and making sure that we are achieving what we need to. So I want to thank our affiliates and panelists tonight from Respiratory Health Association, Citizens Utility Board, Elevate, and Sierra Club. And once again, thank you to our other people, Daniel Spata and Matt Martin, for giving us their time. I know they had to hop off, but I hope this was information to all of you. And we look forward to being part of this advocacy with everyone. And we'll make sure to get these answers, these questions answered for y'all. So hope y'all have a great evening, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Danny.
Thanks, Danny.